Hey guys, Miss Sailor here. So, we are going to talk about industrialization, the rise of industry in the United States, 1816 to 1825. So, during the 19th century, the United States is experiencing a lot of changes. With each passing decade, its agrarian society is giving way to a more diverse urban economy and society. You have this growth of factories and cities that are emerging alongside farms and towns. The pace of life accelerates with industrialization. Between 1790 and 1820, the nation's borders expanded, and its population, both white and black, skyrocketed while the number of Native Americans continued to decline. You have a lot of immigrants that are coming in from Ireland and Germany, Scandinavia, and even China. By the early 1820s, the number of enslaved Americans had more than 2.5 times greater than that of 1790. So the number of free blacks are also doubling alongside. The white population is growing just as rapidly. Until the 19th century, most of the American population was credited near the seacoast and along rivers flowing into the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. But after 1800, the great theme of American development was the migrations of millions across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley and the Middle West. So waves of adventurous Americans are crossing the Mississippi River, and they're spreading out across the Great Plains. So by the 1840s, American settlers had reached the Pacific Ocean. These developments, the emergence of a market-based economy, the impact of industrial development, and the dramatic territorial expansion made the second quarter of the 19th century a time of optimism and rapid change. A German visitor had noted that 10 years in America are like a century elsewhere. Now, during the first half of the 19th century, there are really two different societies. You have the North and you have the South. They grew more competitive with one another. The North has a more dynamic and faster growing region. It embraced industrial growth. There were larger cities. There are foreign immigrants, and the ideal of a free labor as opposed to the system of slavery that was in the southern states. And while this is going on, the South remained heavily rural. They're agrarian, so they're relying on farming, and increasingly they are relying on enslaved labor as the backbone of its cotton-centered society. See, no sooner had the celebrations marking the end of the War of 1812 subsided than Americans are getting busy about transforming their young nation. Prosperity returned as British and European markets again welcomed American ships. During the war, the loss of trade with Britain and Europe had forced the United States to develop more factories and mills of its own. It spurs that growth of diversity that Alexander Hamilton had envisioned for the economy in the 1790s. So between 1815 and 1850, the United States became also a transcontinental power. We were extending all the way to the Pacific coast. Hundreds of thousands of land-hungry people are streaming westward. Between 1815 and 1820 alone, between 1815 and 1821 alone, 6 new states are introduced to the Union: Alabama, Illinois, Indiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Maine. That lure of cheap land and plentiful jobs, also as a promise of political and religious freedom, begins attracting millions of hardworking immigrants. This wasn't technically always welcomed, as these immigrants had troubles with ethnic prejudice, anti-Catholicism, language barriers that made it difficult to assimilate into American society and culture, but they did flow inward into the country. So this is kind of referred to as the era of good feeling. the War of 1812 had created a sense of national unity. There's this rise of American nationalism, and you also have the end of the Federalist Party going on. In 1851, the president of the New York Agricultural Society noted that until the 19th century, production for consumption was the leading purpose of a farm economy. Now, however, no farmer could find it routable to do everything himself. He now sells for money. So the market economy, though, needed internal improvements on top. So you have this plan, the American system proposed by Henry Clay to nip economic issues in the bud. So he has these ideas about the national bank, internal improvements, specifically on transportation, and protective tariffs. In a message to Congress in late 1815, President Madison revealed how much the challenges of war, especially the weaknesses of the armed forces and federal financing, had changed his attitudes about the role of the federal government. Now, Madison and other leading Southern Republicans were beginning to act like nationalists rather than states' rights secessionalists. They had abandoned Jefferson's presidential initiatives in favor of this economic nationalism advanced by Federalists like Alexander Hamilton. So he needed this new national bank, and he needs tariffs to protect American manufacturers. So in 1816, in response to the growing financial turmoil, Madison asked Congress to establish the second bank of the United States, the BUS. They do recharter it. And with the help of Henry Clay and also John C. Calhoun, Congress follows through. The BUS was intended primarily to support a stable national currency that would promote economic growth. So in return for issuing paper and opening branches in every state, it was to handle all federal government funds without charge, lending the government up to $5 million upon demand, and paying the government $1.5 million. Now, this Supreme Court case that is mentioned here in the slide was set in 1819. Chief Justice John Marshall, it was one of his most significant interpretations of the constitutional system. See, James here, McCulloch, he is a clerk in Baltimore. He refused to pay state taxes on the BUS currency as required by Maryland law. So the state indicted him. He appealed to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that Congress had the authority to charter the BUS and that the states had no right to tax the national bank. Now, here we also have Henry Clay's internal improvements. He wants to improve the nation's transportation system. Until the 19th century, travel had been slow, uncomfortable, and very expensive. It took a horse-drawn carriage, for example, 4 days to go from New York City to Boston. Because of long travel times, many farm products could only be sold locally because they spoiled. This soon changes as an array of innovations, like new roads, canals, steamboats, and railroads, knit together the expanding national market for goods and services, and it accelerates the pace of life. So in 1803, when Ohio becomes a state, Congress ordered that 5% of that money from land sales in the state would go towards building a national road. Construction finally begins in 1811. Originally called the Cumberland Road, it is the first interstate roadway financed by a federal government. Now, by 1818, the road was open from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia, where it crosses the Ohio River. By 1838, the national road extended 600 miles further into Illinois, westward into Illinois. So the national road quickened the settlement west and the emergence of a truly national market economy by reducing transportation costs, opening new markets, and stimulating the growth of new towns. So farmers increasingly took their produce and their livestock to sell in distant markets. To the northeast, a movement for paved roads also gathered momentum after the Philadelphia-Lancaster Turnpike opened in 1794. Now, turnpike is derived from a pole or pike at a toll gate, which was then turned to admit traffic in exchange for a small fee. In the South, we still refer to them as toll roads, but in the North, they are still referred to as a turnpike. In fact, Pennsylvania still has their main Pennsylvania Turnpike that they use. Now, what you saw on the slide also was the Erie Canal. See, by the early 1820s, the turnpike boom had given way to the advancements in water transportation. Steamboats, flatboats, and canal barges carried people and goods more cheaply than horse-drawn wagons. Hundreds of flatboats floated goods, farm produce, livestock, and people from Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and other states down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Flatboats, however, only went one direction, downstream. So there's difficulties of getting back upriver. These are solved by Robert Fulton and Robert R. Livingston when they send the Clermont, the first commercial steamboat, up the Hudson River from New York City in 1807. So thereafter, the use of wood-fired steamboats grows rapidly. By bringing two-way travel to the Mississippi Valley, steamboats created a transcontinental market and a commercial agriculture empire that produced much of the nation's cotton, timber, wheat, corn, cattle, and hogs. By 1836, there were 750 steamboats operating on American rivers. So it really, really helped spread the growth of our nation. Now, the historic Erie Canal in central New York connected the Great Lakes and the Midwest to the Hudson River and New York City. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton took to the leading project. He knew it was risky, but he took to it anyway. Thomas Jefferson actually dismissed it as madness. Clinton, however, boasted that New York had an opportunity to create a new era of history. It was 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and it is the largest canal in the world. It extended some 363 miles across from New York, from Albany to east to Buffalo and Lake Erie in the west. The Erie Canal also had an enormous economic and political consequences as well, as it tied the two regions' economies of the Midwest and the East, but further isolated the Deep South. So the channel, however, is very short-lived. During the second quarter of the 19th century, a much less expensive, but much more efficient and versatile transportation emerges: the railroad. By 1825, the year the Erie Canal was completed, the world's first steam-powered railway was operating in England. So then after a railroad building became a thing in the United States. By 1830, the nation only had 23 miles, but over the next 23 years, railroad tracks covered up to 30,626 miles. So the railroad quickly surpassed other forms of transportations because trains could outpace wagons and boats. They could move twice the speed of stagecoaches and 4 times that of boats and barges. They're able to operate year-round. Over rail travel, it's a huge advantage. The canals freeze in winter. Dirt roads become rivers of mud during rainstorms. So they stimulate the nation's economy, not only by improving transportation, but by creating a huge demand for iron, wooden cross ties, bridges, locomotives, freight cars, and other equipment. So next one, we will begin the discussion on the protective tariffs.